Russia, the land of a thousand contradictions, the birthplace of Ivazovsky and his very iconic art, but also the birthplace of Russian dashcam footage, the birthplace of Tchaikovsky and his masterpieces, but also the birthplace of hard baths, the birthplace of Theodore Dostoevsky, but also the birthplace of that son of a bitch that made you want to rage quit playing CSGO.
Пошел нахуй, даун ебаный, ебал твою, блядь, семью пидорасов, сука, блядь!
Regardless of those contradictions, it is incredibly irresponsible of anyone basically to deny Russia of all those incredible achievements. And every single one of them can trace its origins to one single man. Tsar of Russia, Peter the First, aka Peter the Great. Why is he called the Great, you might ask? Well, that's because he is responsible for modernizing Russia from what was basically a medieval backward state in the far east of Europe to basically a European powerhouse. This obviously begs the question, what would have happened, not just in Russia, but in the world in general, had Peter the Great's attempts failed? I know this was a gross oversimplification, but I really wanted to use this meme. I don't blame me. Even though I'm a huge fan of using hyperbole, especially if it makes me laugh, I'm willing to make the case that this meme is not that far off from the truth. And there are multiple reasons for that, but the main ones are, first of all, Russia was for the longest time under Mongol influence, especially under the Golden Horde, which, as we all know, lasted all the way until the 15th century. Now, the 15th century and the 17th century are not that far off, technologically speaking and culturally speaking, especially in Russia. This is very important, especially when you compare it to what was happening in Western Europe, because after the fall of Constantinople, as we all know, Greek thinkers moved west, especially to places like Venice, Padua, and Genoa, and they started basically preaching forgotten Greek knowledge, especially Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, and this gave birth to the Enlightenment and the Renaissance. Or rather, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, but these are semantics. At the same time, in Northern Europe, the Reformation had already gone into full effect, with countries such as England, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Scotland basically cutting ties from Rome and doing their own thing, religiously speaking. But one really important thing that is the result of them previously being Catholic was this large scholastic tradition, which came from figures like Thomas Aquinas, but was also appreciated greatly and also greatly developed by Martin Luther, John Calvin, Knox, and the list goes on. Obviously, all of those were ideas that greatly impacted Peter the Great, especially after he went on to study in Western Europe. He basically fell in love with Western literature, Western governance, with the Handbook of the Christian Prince by Erasmus being one of his favorite books growing up. But this begs the question, what would have happened if he failed tremendously? Because keep in mind, let's say that even if Peter the Great was never born, there still would have been down the line at least one czar that would have tried to implement what he did. So I'm pretty sure that the best case scenario for this thought experiment to work would be that the ruling class, meaning the elite, the elites, or the boyars, or as they were known in Eastern Europe, basically put him in this place. I basically strong-armed him into not doing anything and just accepting the status quo that was working so well in their favor. The difference we would see in our timeline would probably be the borders of Russia. Because keep in mind, one of the reasons why Russia expanded to be the single largest country in the world right now by landmass is because of Peter the Great's military reforms. He basically copied French and German and Dutch military tactics and basically applied them to the Russian army, especially by giving them uniforms, making them march in formation, and doing Western style drills prior to basically Mongol tactics. It kind of feels like a cheap shot because it kind of is, but at the same time, it's very accurate that basically because of the many years of Mongol influence, Russians had basically pretty much become Mongols themselves, especially militarily, is why they basically relied on armies that were very heavy on cavalry. They did not use uh, fortifications made out of concrete like the rest of Europe did. Instead, they relied on wooden forts, which they could be burned easily, much like the Mongols did. And they heavily relied on archers, again, much like the Mongols did. So everything makes sense. It's not just that I want to take a cheap shot at Russia, but if it wasn't for Peter the Great, they basically would have become white Mongols themselves. Does this mean that there would have been zero further Russian expansion? I'm willing to say that no, it doesn't mean that. It just means that in certain areas, Russian expansion would have worked significantly slower than it did in our timeline. And in certain areas, especially in the Russian Far East, it probably wouldn't have been as successful because it it was an incredibly difficult endeavor for Russia to conquer that much land. This would be interesting for multiple reasons, but more importantly, it would probably shift the power balance in Eurasia so drastically that there is a non-zero chance that we could have seen a rebirth in Mongolian nationalism, especially with ethnicities like the Buryats joining Mongolia proper, and maybe even Inner Mongolia joining in to create this greater Mongolia. Maybe even the areas around Vladivostok, basically being controlled either by Japan or Korea, or sometimes because it's also a lot closer to Manchuria, maybe even China. This would be actually a very interesting scenario to think about as to how the power dynamics would have changed throughout Eastern Eurasia. Another very obvious change that would have happened in our timeline is the fact that Russian culture would have been significantly different and significantly poorer as it is right now, because this means that authors like Dostoevsky wouldn't have existed as they did in our timeline. Hypothetical wouldn't have existed as he did in our timeline. And the many Russian composers wouldn't have had the impact that they did because a lot of it came obviously from Western Europe, which later influenced people like Stravinsky and Tchaikovsky to write the masterpieces that we all know and love. Another thing that would have happened in our timeline is that Russia would have become a semi-theocratic state. This is because Peter the Great was very famously very critical of the Russian Orthodox Church, but also of Roman Catholicism, and generally he was very much in favor of criticizing religion and sometimes even openly making fun of it. In fact, he did start a drinking club in St. Petersburg known as the All Joking Society of Fools, in which he and his drinking buddies would just basically make fun of the Russian church, the clerics, and basically get into shenanigans. Because Eastern Orthodoxy inherited a lot of its structure from the Byzantine Church, it is by definition a Caesaro-Papist church, meaning that it doesn't believe in separating temporal and divine authority. In fact, it is very much in favor of merging them at times, especially if it benefits them so. This would obviously create something more akin to a Christian version of Iran in our timelines. Of course, there would still be religious minorities, as it still did in our timeline. But the many religious minorities, be it the pagan Finnic peoples like the Perms and the Komi, be it the Muslim Tatars, the various Jews, and sometimes even some Protestants and Catholic minorities, they would have suffered significantly more. Keep in mind, their lives in our timeline were no picnic. I could list countless atrocities by the Tsarist armies, but in our timeline, it would have gone into overdrive. Lastly, I want to get into the political side of things because let's say that Russia never westernizes, a lot of its political influence, especially in European affairs, it wouldn't have existed whatsoever. There would be no Russian involvement to the war of the First or the Second Coalition. There would be no Russian fighting against Napoleon. There would probably not even be any Russian involvement against the Ottoman Empire, which obviously would have shifted European politics further significantly, especially when it came to the various, especially Slavic liberational movements in the Balkans in the 19th century. So, yeah, these are some of my thoughts on this. Obviously, if you think I missed something, you can let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, share the video, hit the bell so you can get notified on my next video, and I will see you on the next one.